So, welcome to the next edition of Rare Business Podcast. With me today, I have Ian Fitzpatrick, who is the Chief Strategy Officer of Almighty. Hi, Ian.
Hi, how are you, Adrian?
I'm very well, sir. So, Ian, for the benefit of our listeners and readers, can you tell us a little bit about you and also a little bit about the sort of work that you do across there at Almighty?
Sure. So, like you said, I'm nominally Chief Strategy Officer at Almighty here in Boston. That title strategy covers a lot of sins. I suppose it also gives me a great deal of latitude. For the past 11 or so years, what it's meant for me is that I'm the one getting my hands dirty in a client's sort of broader business objectives, whether that's helping a brand like New Balance figure out, okay, how are we going to sell more sneakers in new markets, or an apparel brand like LL Bean figure out what does it mean for us to be newly relevant in a world sort of defined by the REIs of the space, right? I lead a team of 30 or so people here in Boston through a sort of a hybrid of brand strategy, pure experience design, user experience work, sort of in that capacity. My background is I came out of, like in a number of people you speak to, advertising. Right? So I came out of the giant behemoth of Havas in 2004, where we helped do things like launch Mini in the United States or launch the Truth anti sort of teen smoking campaigns. And what I was finding is that the work I was really suited for was terribly non-traditional, that the second it got very traditional, I wasn't terribly interested in it, but I also found that, at least in the holding company model, we were really, really abstracted from any notion of the end user. I remember the very day that I came home and told my wife I was leaving to go start my own thing, I'd been on a 14-office conference call about the launch of a new Peugeot.
Right.
And for your customers' context, Peugeots aren't sold in the States. Okay. Right? So here we were launching a product for a market we didn't know, a product we'd never see or touch, and somehow the idea that because we had automotive experience, we were able to develop something useful or reasonable for somebody was completely irrelevant to the cause. So the goal in starting Almighty all those years ago was to try to do work that got us a lot closer to customer needs, brand business objectives, and finding that sweet spot where those two things intersect and we might do something meaningful.
Okay, excellent. Now, so I do lots of exploration in the sort of service and experience improvement sort of space, and there's one guy called Ian Golding that I read his stuff every now and again, and he wrote a piece on his blog around a recent report that you have just put out. Now, first of all, hat tip to Ian for finding this and then put me onto it. But the report's called Hearts Then Charts, a practical framework for building and leading a customer-centered organization. So, and that got my attention. I was like, oh, that's interesting, because I've just been exploring I explore a few ideas around that. So can you first of all tell me a little bit about the report and why you put it together? Because it's, I guess, in many ways, given what you've just said, I'm interested to kind of understand the leap between what you've kind of just said and what you kind of do on the surface, I guess, and kind of what then that sort of report and what it's alluding to.
Well, so Adrian, the impetus for it was really quite simple. We spend, as all manner of various agencies, whether they're brand and marketing agencies or XD firms, spend an awful lot of time digging under the hood, trying to get to customer needs, customer motivations, right? We spend a lot of time digging inside of client organizations and saying, okay, what are the policies or systems or infrastructure that will allow us to meet those needs in a better way, right? And those manifest themselves in things like customer personas and archetypes or elaborate customer journeys. And they come at a not insignificant cost to the client. And what we found so frequently, especially in, and this is anecdotal, but in our longest tenured relationships, is that these wonderful these outputs were really not tying to outcome as well as we'd presumed.
Right.
And what we found increasingly was that they were sitting on servers or rolled up in the corner of somebody's cube. And we began to wonder, is this epidemic?
Right.
Are we creating outputs collectively, well beyond the scope of our client roster,
sure,
that don't generate outcomes because they don't adhere to the organization? You know, I was having dinner not that long ago with a gentleman who's with a surgeon whose entire sort of life experience is in performing transplants, right? And I was talking to, we were having a conversation about, of all things, performance metrics. He was asking all about our business. And I related to him. I turned it back on him and said, well, what are your metrics? And his answer was really, really simple. He said, acceptance rate. The organ takes or it doesn't take.
Right.
The most elegant execution that doesn't take is a fail. And the most haphazard one, although it's not a word he would use, that does take is a success. All we care about is that the organ's accepted. And that became a really interesting metaphor for the way we talk about the artifacts that we create. Is what is it about a archetype or a persona that gets accepted by the body that is that organization, such that they can act upon it?
Sure.
So we set out to do a study of what was actually going on in the marketplace. How are customer experiences measured? What are they predicated upon? How does the organization define user need? How much of the broad journey does the organization have a meaningful sense of and adapt to? So that involved 30 in-house discovery sessions on the client side. So a broad range of sort of large scale and some small scale enterprises. And then another panel of almost 600 executives at other firms to try to get a sense of what's actually going on inside of the organizations themselves. And what we found, not terribly surprising, but anytime you can put a number to it, it gets a lot more compelling. What we found is that the experiences we were having were legion, right? That personas have been developed broadly and almost completely disposed of. The core finding, or at least the initial finding that blew our minds, was to look at organizations that have persona development that takes on one form in a design or a product group, another form in a marketing group, and yet another form in a sales group, such that organizations were designing products for one set of people, marketing them to yet another, and selling to yet another.
So there's just no joint thinking or communication.
Well, there was no lateral integration
Sure.
of a set of personas. There's no shared sense inside of these organizations, frequently.
And is that because it's just not coordinated, or people aren't talking to each other, or what's going on?
There were plenty of reasons for it. We found things. So of the 30 organizations that we did a deep dive with, 2 had connected personas across product and design, marketing, and sales.
Okay.
The reasons for those were widely varied. The high turnover rate in so many of these organizations, particularly within sales and marketing, was leading people to not adopt the outputs or the documentation of their predecessors, right? New group comes in, new lead comes in, out with the old archetypes, in with a new set of assumptions.
So can we stop there? I mean, because here's a question I have on that is that, so you talk about the turnover, and is that the turnover because in terms of people developing their own career and you get into this 18 months to 2 years sort of like go to a new job type of thing? Or is it turnover that people are getting fired?
Oh, I wouldn't want to come to a conclusion from such a small sample size,
okay,
Adrian. But anecdotally, what we heard a lot of is that when this person left, this person who was a champion of a certain brand of design thinking or a certain form of customer experience, that with them went the sort of the collective outputs or the personas documentation, right?
Right.
We also heard from organizations that said, look, the design group doesn't trust that the marketing group's personas are in line with what the market wants, right? Or that the sales group sees the world a little differently than the marketing group or design group. And what concerned us as we looked at that is that's all well and good, but rather than having a conversation and aligning around a specific set of customers, these groups had gone out and commissioned their own, right? Which is, by the way, loaded with confirmation bias. And the idea that we can now work in service of the customer leans on a really shaky definition of who that customer is.
Sure.
So we found that in droves. We also found remarkably limited use of things like customer journeys, which customers or brands love to buy from firms or seem to love to buy. There's an enormous amount of chatter in the market, and it makes up a significant portion of our business. But what we found were two problems with those. First, that they were remarkably limited in scope. Very few organizations had mapped out in any detail. In fact, I believe only one of the 30 off the top of my head had mapped out any portions of the experience that lie outside of the direct purview of that organization.
Right.
So really, really limited view into things like what is the shipping or what's the postal experience like? What's the delivery experience? If a customer taps into a third-party platform, as so many of us do for checkout, for an e-commerce business, or any number of other kinds of interactions, that part of the journey was left entirely blank. So these journeys increasingly, we found, reflect the organization's understanding of their own worlds, but really very little understanding of what the customer actually experiences. And that alarmed us.
Yeah. But I mean, that's kind of fascinating because it also aligns with that, a number of different sort of things that I've kind of been finding is one is that, so I spoke to a gentleman a little while ago, and he was talking about an experience or service improvement process that he's going through. And this was at a financial services firm, sort of a retail financial services firm. And he was talking about how the program that they were going through, that it took him about 6 months to get broad support, about 2 years thereafter to get something kind of going and start to debug it and then build up momentum and then start the rollout. But then it was probably going to take him another sort of like 18 months or so until he felt that the organization was there enough or got it enough, as it were, that it would become a sustainable, like you talk about in the report, building the muscle memory around becoming a customer-centric organization. And so it almost feels like to me there's this sort of juxtaposition between how long it takes to deliver that or to become that sort of organization, but also some of the dynamics that go on within organizations, particularly at a professional level, in terms of how long people stick around and how they communicate between functions and laterally and et cetera, et cetera. And so that it makes me think that even though that people talk about we're in this age of the customer or the age of experience or whatever, that we've still got some way to go before there's a maturation of this understanding of what it takes to deliver the sort of organizations that we believe and hope that firms aspire to. Would you agree with that?
I would. I think we're our own worst enemy, though. I think that we've come to believe that it's the age of experience because that's what we're spending time and money on.
Okay. Yeah, that's true.
Right? Not so much because there's a particular embrace of it. We've made it enormously complicated.
Yeah.
When in reality, we've mistaken fidelity for utility, right? We've mistaken the idea that having a perfectly dialed in, refined, thoroughly processed picture of the customer has greater value to the organization, or one that's perfectly dialed in but held by only a few people is more valuable than having something much broader that is widely or as close to, as possible to universally adopted, right? So we've focused on outputs, getting the journey mapped on a 30-foot diagram that we can hang up somewhere and all dissect, right? Which is, of course, completely antithetical to any social notion of utility.
Sure.
To the when perhaps a much better outcome, and I'm sure some of your listeners will dismiss this as being overly simplistic, but I'd be glad to argue with them. When an organization can say we make things for two people, Stephen and Jane, Stephen shops in this way, Jane is this kind of person who does things in this way, and when everybody down to the postal, to the mail sorting room and the admins can recite those things, you're going to have a much better ability to not only understand and speak to customer need, but to retain the sense of those customers over time.
Sure.
The hang-up comes that when 2 or 3 key linchpins in an organization who led a customer experience initiative depart for greener pastures, you lose all of that investment in an understanding of who your customer is. We've gotten way too precious about it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, yes, like you rightly say, we are our own kind of worst enemies. We inherently have a predisposition towards complication, I would say, or complexity, and over-engineering things, I think, which is interesting. But going back to the report, you talked about in the report about this, and I just mentioned it before, about this idea about building muscle memory around the basics of a customer-centric organization. But in the report, you also kind of outline sort of 5 key themes about what it's going to take to do that based on your the research and interviews and deep dives that you've done. Can you give us an outline of what those themes might be?
Sure. The 5 themes that we identified most central to building that kind of organization start with a shared sense of who are our customers, who are our most important customers, right? Yeah. And the capacity of an organization to not only be able to give them a name and give them a shape, but to socialize that understanding. Yeah. Right? And we would argue, as I just sort of did, that the ability of that information to permeate the organization is more important up to a point, obviously, than the absolute fidelity or detail of that information. Sure. The second piece that we found is, or the second piece that we outline, is the capacity to map and understand the end-to-end experience that those customers have. Understanding, of course, as it way too often is ignored, that experience starts well before they become a customer, well before they walk into a store or visit a website or pick up the phone.
And includes all the bits includes all the bits at the end or on the side that sort of facilitate that journey as well, I guess.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So an understanding of what each of those phases and interactions is. And again, this need not be so complex that it can't be communicated. What you're looking for is a sweet spot between some sort of fidelity and some sort of acceptance. The third piece is a general understanding of user needs at each point along that way, right? What is it that the customer actually needs? And being able to frame that up in a way that people internally can act upon it. And frankly, that isn't contrived.
Yeah.
Right? Not way too often, right? Our assumptions around those needs is that they need our product and that they need the best, most elaborate version of our product, when in our experience, that's almost never the case.
Sure.
The fourth thing we outline is a consistent set of measures, however rudimentary, right? Some people swear by and love Net Promoter Score, although I have my concerns that that's beginning to wear out its welcome in some ways. Other people like much more nuanced and detailed scorecards, and all of that's fine. It's fine to adopt the one that suits the nature of an organization, but there needs to be a set of measures, that those measures need to work across the organization, and most importantly, people need to understand how that measure ties to business success.
Yeah.
Right? And then the final sort of thing that we outline in this report is the need for someone within the organization, preferably someone quite senior, to have an absolute accountability for the quality of the experience that the organization delivers. It's funny, one of the things we asked in the survey of executives was, do you know who in your organization is responsible for your customer experience? And who is that person?
Sure.
And what we found was, I don't know if it's tragic or comic, or both, chaos in the response. What we found, for example, one U.S. health provider network, here we had 8 different responses from people at a level of director or above, and each of them cited a different person within their organization that was accountable.
Sure.
Some of these respondents reported to one another, and yet still answered in very, very different terms, right? At a national pharmaceutical drugstore chain, we had the same thing where of 8 respondents, 6 said, yes, absolutely, somebody in our organization is responsible for customer experience, and named 6 very different people, all the way from a senior designer, which is a stunning response, to the manager of corporate communications, right? So what we're finding is that while people believe this is important and believe accountability exists somewhere, they're not at all sure who it is within the organization.
Okay. Wow. I'm not even going to delve into that. Those are headlines enough, particularly the last one.
Well, think about it in this way. One of the numbers that blew my mind, right? So of the 188 companies in total that we surveyed, in 44 of those, we had 3 or more respondents say, yes, I know who's responsible for the quality of the experience that we delivered. So 44 companies out of 188 had a plurality of people who said, yes, I know who's accountable. In only one of those 44 did everybody name the same person.
Oh my word. Wow.
Right? Now, okay. I'm not going to derive truth from that, because again, we're dealing with a fairly small sample size, but there's enough there to lead us to the conclusion that it's not clear who's responsible.
Sure. I mean, if that's just merely indicative of some of the issues that are, or some of the things that are kind of going on, it says that there's a lot of work to be done.
Well, what it says to me is that all of this fast company rhetoric around it being the age of the customer has yet to manifest itself in meaningful ways. When you ask inside a large organization who's responsible for the communications that we put out, for the messages that we put out, most people would be able to draw a dotted line and say the ultimate accountability lies with the chief marketing officer, right, or chief brand officer. And the same on the product side. What it tells me is that we haven't matured to a place yet in these organizations that allows us to make the same statement about the experience. So while there's a lot of talk about it, there's relatively little overall investment, and there's not clear lines of communication. We also see that increasingly customer experience, which at least in the States has been driven in large part in recent years by marketing functions, is migrating quickly to operational functions, right? That increasingly that responsibility is moving from, say, the CMO to the COO. Right. Although I don't believe that transition is what's driving most of this chaos.
Right, okay. So in all of that sort of chaos, Ian, can you give us some hope? Can you maybe give us an example of a firm or a brand that you think is actually kind of getting it right, and what they're doing to get it right, and sort of how they're kind of benefiting? Because, I mean, we know it's a small sample. We know it's not representative, but the findings nevertheless are quite alarming. And so, rather than be completely negative, give us some hope, Ian.
Oh, I think there's plenty of hope. My favorite story is it's actually from a Boston pharmaceutical startup called PillPack.
Okay.
Wonderful, wonderful organization, growing at an incredible rate. But one of the things that the founders, TJ and Elliot, have done that I think is absolutely magical is that they have, and again, I'm not the biggest proponent of Net Promoter Score.
Uh-huh.
They've got screens going in real time across both their pharmacy and their main office, reading out real-time customer service scores.
Okay.
And if you walk into their office, you can ask anybody right now, don't look, what's our Net Promoter Score? And they're going to be able to tell you.
Okay.
With stunning accuracy. But more than that, they're going to be able to tell you how it is that impacts their business, and even more so, what they can do on an individual level to impact that score. Right. So TJ and Elliot have done a wonderful job of communicating down within the organization. Here's how we measure things, and here's how individually you can change that outcome. And I think that's what customer experience begins with, right? Is the empowering of people to actually affect outcomes, right? Because empowering people to do that creates the collective will to invest in those outcomes. Yeah. It's a really, really tough thing to get people to do, to allocate dollars inside of a large enterprise against customer experience if they don't believe that it will drive something that they can hold up for themselves and say, see what I accomplished and see what I'm driving.
Sure.
And I think that's a big part of what's missing, is that it's still a very intangible idea to so many people.
Yeah, it's true. I don't think it's really drilled down to help people understand kind of what it means to what these things mean to them on an individual and day-to-day kind of basis, and that's not necessarily just from a financial reward perspective, but it's almost from a perspective of how do I make the lives of my customers or the experience of my customers kind of better, and on the flip side of that is how can we make my experience as an employee better, because that will help me deliver a better experience for my customers too. And so it almost has to go all the way down into the weeds for people to kind of actually really get it, as it were.
I couldn't agree more. I think the other hope is that this doesn't need to be all that hard.
No.
Again, I think we've wildly overcomplicated what it means at its core to deliver a great customer experience. It's really 5 very simple things. Mm-hmm. It's who are our customers? Mm-hmm. What at a very high level is the experience they go through in being our customer? Mm-hmm. What are the needs at each of those places? How do we measure our ability to meet those needs? Mm-hmm. Right? And how do we create top-down accountability for working to ensure that we meet the highest possible measure against those metrics, right? Sure. And yes, there's a lot of work to be done there. I think even the most rudimentary attempt to solve those and to distribute that knowledge through the organization beats out a massive multi-million-dollar investment in a customer journey that one group uses every single time.
You know what, Ian? And that's so related to a piece that I wrote recently for my Forbes column, and the title was, "Can we stop talking about customer experience and digital transformation, please?"
Please.
And because I just told a story and then told some stats around kind of how most of them fail, and kind of got into some behavioral sort of psychological, neuroscientific sort of stuff about the use of language and things. And my point was, I don't think this talk is helping us. I don't think the approach is helping us. But actually, an approach that probably would be more helpful is if we start talking about, and this is to your point as well, is if we start talking about an evolution rather than a transformation, then we just know that this stuff doesn't get finished. It just has to be a way of doing things.
Well, and it has to come from within. Look, sure. I founded an agency that works outside of client organizations, but I think something that has been lost, no firm, not McKinsey, not Almighty, 2 companies at a very different end of the spectrum, can affect the kind of change inside of a client organization that's necessary to pull this off. We can be tools that you use to help you divine truth. We can be tools that help come in and ask tough questions, but we can't facilitate that change, right? That fundamentally, this has to be driven by the collective will of the organization, and not just at the highest level, and certainly not just within one department, right? Yep. I mean, the survey data itself speaks to the danger of one particular group going off and deciding to, quote, own the customer experience.
Yeah.
One of the real challenges inside the contemporary organization is that in the absence of a real vision for customer experience, decisions get pushed to really functional places, right? An IT group makes a decision about a web CMS that all of a sudden has profound impact on the experience you deliver. And unless that ties back to a larger understanding of who the customer is, what their needs are, you've pushed out a central piece of that experience to a functional team, right? No one group can own this. It needs to come from within, and it needs to come from the heart of the organization. Like any transformation. Absolutely. My wife can't make me get in better shape. I have to want to eat well and run.
Yeah, no, she can help though by kind of like poking and badgering and hectoring and all that.
Well, she can help. She can be an asset for me in that transition. I doubt my wife likes being referred to as an asset, but but my fundamental point is that the will has to come internally. Absolutely. No agency can facilitate this change for a client.
So, Ian, before I'm conscious of time, but before I ask you my kind of final question, I always finish on this: is that so? Where would you advocate if a listener is listening to this and they're thinking, "Yeah, we need to that sounds like a lot like us in terms of some of the challenges, but we need to get back on track, or we need to find the track, as it were, to really start building this customer-centric centered organization." Apart from reading the report, which I'll get all linked up and everything else and point people to that, where would you advocate that they start?
I would advocate that they do an inventory. I would advocate that they pull together, or maybe even attack independently and then assemble the leads of the people who design the product or service, the people who market it, and the people who sell it, and ask each of them, who are we making this for?
Right.
Who are we making it for, selling it to, marketing it to? Get a sense of where do you stand. And then as quickly as possible, pull together a team of people to unify that. And my one tip, and this comes across in the paper, but the one thing I can't stress enough is start with the people who touch the customer.
Sure.
Start with the field technicians or the customer service people. Too many people, by the way, conflate customer service and customer experience, but that's its own podcast episode.
Yeah.
Start with the people who are closest to the customer on the ground, the ones with the least investment in towing the company line, the ones with the least investment in company mythology, the ones who hear the pain and the joy, and who actually share in the emotional experience of being your customer, and get them together to talk about who it is that you're making things for, selling things to, right? Every good exercise will start there.
Yeah.
In my experience. You can read all you want. There's plenty of great books and plenty of great papers. McKinsey's written a lot on the topic, some of it really quite good. Boston Consulting Group is also writing some excellent material on it at the moment. But again, I would go back to how do we create some very simple exercises that build alignment before I ever got into anything terribly fancy.
Fantastic. That's, brilliant. Simple, straight to the point, and you know what? Common sense that's not that common sometimes.
Well, most of this is fundamentally simple. It's not as if customer experience simply became, a new idea in the last 5-10 years, right? It's as old as commerce.
Absolutely.
Right? So let's not get too up with ourselves.
Absolutely. So Ian, here's my final question that I always ask at the end of these podcasts, and that is this: is there anything that you would like to shamelessly plug?
No, I don't usually have any shame, but I also don't have a ton of outputs. I suppose I would plug a few other things that your readers ought to be reading or listening to in addition to your podcast that might be excellent uses of their time. Neil Perkin writes a wonderful blog that so often touches on organizational design, organizational principles and experience, called Only Dead Fish.
Okay.
It's a wonderful newsletter that I would encourage all of your readers to or listeners to tap into. But no, most of all, I would tell people to spend their time looking at inside their own organization, not reading more or listening more.
Fantastic.
Except to you, Adrian.
Of course. Thank you very much.
But certainly not to me.
Ian, that's been incredibly interesting and really useful, and it's been a pleasure for me talking to you, and I'll make sure that I get all that edited up and get everything highlighted up, and thank you for the recommendation of Mr. Perkins' kind of blog, which I didn't know about, so I will be signing up for his newsletter myself. But just finally to say thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Likewise.